Well, what about Shepard? Earthborn, but no record of her family.
Doesn't have one. She was raised on the streets, learned to look out for herself.
She saw her whole unit die on Akuz. She could have some serious emotional scars.
Every soldier has scars. Shepard's a survivor.
Is that the kind of person we want protecting the galaxy?
That's the only kind of person who can protect the galaxy.
I'll make the call.
Originally, when I wrote the script to this video, I opened by explaining that nobody really talked about Mass Effect 1. But, to my surprise, when I finally finished writing the script and recording the gameplay, a few YouTube videos popped up in my recommended section that were similar. At first I was a bit disappointed, since this makes my video a bit redundant, but honestly, I'm just so happy that people are starting to pay attention to the first game. Now the aim of this video is not to state that the original Mass Effect was the best, but rather to explain some of the things the original game did really well that were absent in the other two. And I feel the need to make this video because Mass Effect 1 is often overlooked or passed by. The sad reality of the first game is that changes in the mentality of gamers have pushed it into the background, and I feel that many modern gamers simply can't appreciate the elements that made the original Mass Effect so great. So if you're a fan of Mass Effect but find that you can't quite get into the original game, or you just like hearing opinions on game design, this video is for you. Now, before I get into this, I just want to make it clear that I don't think you're an idiot or not a true fan for not liking Mass Effect 1. I just want to make people understand the elements of a great game. Too often do I hear people say that the original had a really good story but bad gameplay, or that Mass Effect 1 pales in comparison to the second. And as much as it pains me to hear people say that, I think it's important to understand why Mass Effect 2 resonated with the Mass Effect fanbase more than the original did. And I think the reason is that the original Mass Effect came out at a very critical time in gaming history. Mass Effect 1 launched in 2007, which you may note is the same year that big games like Call of Duty 4 and Halo 3 were released, and their massive success had a major impact in the way in which games were made. But Mass Effect 1 was developed before the release of these games, and therefore wasn't affected by the sudden shift in the industry. Now I know that some of you may be thinking, oh great, here comes the herder every game is turned into Call of Duty speech that you've heard 1,000 times. I want to stress that I don't think Mass Effect 2 and 3 were purposely meant to be more like Call of Duty in particular, but COD ushered in a new generation of gamers. The sales of a game like COD 4 were unprecedented. It was like the equivalent of the games industry striking gold. Gold which began the new era of simplified shooters. And that's the way I feel when I compare the original Mass Effect to Mass Effect 2 and 3. They feel more like simplified shooters to appeal to a larger market. And it doesn't really surprise me that Mass Effect 2 and 3 were pandering to a wider audience, since those games were published by EA with a development budget rumored to be around $40 million. Compare that to the $2.7 million budget for Mass Effect 1, and you can see how they needed to simplify the mechanics to pull in more players and recover costs. Now I'm not entirely against this, there are a lot of benefits that come from a larger budget, and if you like higher budget, more shooter focused games, then I can definitely see how you might like Mass Effect 2 and 3 more than the original. Hell, I love Mass Effect 2 and 3, but not in the same way that I love the original. With the rise of these simplified shooter games came changes in the general mentality of gamers. quick satisfaction, instant gratification, low patience, simplified shooting solutions, fast-paced. While these are often the core tenets of modern action games, they don't really apply to the original Mass Effect, which is why I feel that Mass Effect 1 is almost like an ancient language lost to time. A lot of people can't really see what made the original so good, and hence why I'm making this video.
It cannot be described or explained. It would be like describing color to a creature without eyes.
I want to start off with the aspect of Mass Effect that I hear criticized the most: combat. The original Mass Effect had a somewhat clunky and odd combat system. The shooting mechanics are often considered to be lackluster and unpolished in comparison to Mass Effect 2 and 3. But Mass Effect 1's combat is one of the things that keeps me coming back time and time again, and this is because the core ideas behind the original's combat system are drastically different from 2 and 3's, and Mass Effect 1 is a conceptually different game to play. Where Mass Effect 2 and 3 focuses on weapons, Mass Effect 1 focuses on powers. In 2 and 3, weapons were the main way of dispatching your enemies, and powers acted more as extension of your weapons. If you think of Mass Effect 2, the main effective powers were Warp, Incinerate, and Overload, and these weren't really powers at all. They were essentially missiles that were even color-coded to make it absolutely obvious which power you should use when. Now if you compare this to Mass Effect 1, you will see the stark opposite. Powers were at the core of Mass Effect 1's combat system, and weapons acted as an extension of your powers. And in addition to this, the powers in the original Mass Effect had much more strategic use. Most of the powers in Mass Effect 1 did little to no damage at all, but they changed the way in which the enemies interacted within the game world. In this way, combat in Mass Effect 1 became a question of critical thought. Every enemy encounter is handled differently, every new foe presents a new challenge. You walk around the corner, pull the power wheel, and ask yourself key questions. Which enemies pose the most threat? What powers can I use? When should I use them? While Mass Effect 2 and 3 rush you with visceral combat, Mass Effect 1 gives you time to think and strategize, and in this way, many encounters became a unique puzzle to solve. And sure, some of the more unique powers from Mass Effect 1 like Throw, Singularity, Lift, and Sabotage made their way into Mass Effect 2 and 3, but those powers were practically useless unless you were playing the lower difficulties, or their function was simply changed. Those powers didn't even affect enemies unless their health bar was exposed, but by that time they were usually 1 or 2 shots from death anyways. And to top it off, each power in Mass Effect 2 and 3 reset all power cooldowns. So why would you even bother wasting your valuable regen time to throw a guy who's already about to die anyways? Where if you compare those same powers to their original implementation in Mass Effect 1, powers like Throw, Lift, and Singularity were the difference between life and death. When a Krogan or Get Destroyer is charging at you in the original game, you're dead unless you disable them. Warp in Mass Effect 1 is also a very interesting power. At first I didn't even touch it, since I thought all it did was a small amount of damage over time. But then I realized that it also makes enemies more susceptible to incoming damage. So pairing Warp with a sniper rifle using the assassination power allowed me to do massive damage to, if not one-shotting my enemies. Or use Lift on an enemy to suspend him helplessly in the air and combine Warp and Overkill for when you really need to kill something. Warp became absolutely essential for burning high health targets like Krogan or Geth Primes. Now compare this to Mass Effect 2 and 3's version, it does damage to barriers. That's it. Or look at Sabotage. All it did was turn off guns, but the impact it has on high difficulty play is invaluable, allowing you to stop a sniper or rocket drone from one-hit killing you, or disabling a Geth Prime's weapons just in time for you to fall back and regenerate your shields. And this brings me to another crucial point with the original Mass Effect's combat, the enemy design. Now I will admit, this drastically improved in Mass Effect 3, and while I still think Mass Effect 1 has better enemy design, this is more of a criticism of Mass Effect 2. So in Mass Effect 2 you have the Collectors, Blue Suns, Eclipse, and Bloodpack. And what about the combat changes between those enemy types? One uses shields, one uses barriers, one uses armor, and the Collectors use armor and barriers to make them a bit more difficult. And while each of those factions use a few subunits that are a bit unique, like Krogan or Asari Commandos, they don't change the gameplay other than now I have to dodge a purple or orange missile. The exception to this are the Collectors faction, which I will say are a pretty decent group to fight. Praetorians and Scions were tough enemies, especially when Husks were pressing you, and Harbinger's Ball of Death that knocked you out of cover was genuinely challenging. Yet still, Mass Effect 1's enemies were far more inspired. You had the Geth Shock Troopers with extremely strong shields who would deploy cover in the environment. You had tech specialists who would disable your powers or guns. You had Asari Commandos who would throw you to the ground or use warp to make you vulnerable. You had Geth Destroyers who would charge really fast towards you and deal massive melee damage. You had Krogans who acted similarly to the Geth Destroyers, but they had this immunity power that makes them near invincible, and they would regenerate. Husks would charge at you and deal massive area effect damage. Geth Snipers would pick off your squad mates one by one. Geth Stalkers moved extremely fast, jammed your radar, and used tech powers to harass you. And Geth Primes. You don't know pain until you get to Virmire in Mass Effect 1 on Insanity and run into one of these bastards. The difference I'm trying to show is that these enemies radically change the way you have to play. They make you think very critically about how to play the game and require you to develop your own strategies for certain enemies. And when certain powers are on cooldown, or one of your squad mates are down, this will throw a significant curveball and force you to adapt. With all of this coming together, between the weapon design, power design, and enemy design, the original Mass Effect is really an entirely different game. It's a game that prioritizes thought, strategy, and critical thinking, which is why I feel that fans of Mass Effect 2 and 3 have such a hard time getting into Mass Effect 1. I love the combat in Mass Effect 1, because unlike the sequels, every encounter is an opportunity to reevaluate the situation and try a new tactic. And if it wasn't for Mass Effect 1's awful save system, or that rage-inducing Krogan Battlemaster, I wouldn't find dying frustrating.
I like your attitude.
I can always clearly see the flaws in my thinking, and the game offers me enough options in combat to try something new. I think that all of this is best summarized by the final fight in the Bring Down the Sky DLC, where enemy drones, biotic, and tech specialists really push you to your limits. Now I know that the gameplay in the background shows me cutting through the enemies like a hot knife through butter, but keep in mind that I've put hundreds of hours into this game, and believe me, it wasn't easy to get good at Mass Effect 1. It's a game with a pretty steep learning curve, and that turns a lot of people off. I've recently come to the realization that challenging games have become somewhat of a niche market. It doesn't surprise me at all that BioWare simplified the combat mechanics in Mass Effect 2 and 3, since that's what appeals to most players, which harkens back to the original idea that Mass Effect 2 and 3 were simplified to account for the influx of a new generation of gamers. With this era of simplified shooters, most gamers will judge Mass Effect 1 on its shooting mechanics rather than the entire combat suite as a whole. It feels like they've only ever experienced the game as a soldier class, ignoring their teammates and turning the difficulty down when the game inevitably rubbed their face in the mud. And then they go onto YouTube comment section and say that Mass Effect 1's combat system is terrible, when in reality, they're the ones at fault for trying to play the game like it's just another generic shooter. I understand this mentality very well, since when I played Mass Effect 1 for the first time, this was my experience. I was used to games like Call of Duty and Halo, and I tried to play Mass Effect like it was another shooter game. I rarely, if ever, used powers, my teammates were treated as cannon fodder, and I never tried any other tactic than just run and gun. Playing Mass Effect this way is grueling and brutal. It's the video game equivalent of trying to live in a foreign country. I remember spending over 5 hours trying to kill Matriarch Benezia for the first time. It wasn't until I replayed Mass Effect 1 a second time that things started to change. I played as an infiltrator on a higher difficulty, which really forced me to invest into my powers and squad mates. I started to think and strategize, rather than just shooting. I developed strong tactics and power combinations to overcome my enemies, rather than just filling them with lead. And just like that, the game opened up for me. No longer is Mass Effect 1 just a great story with bad gameplay. It had become one of my favorite games, because unlike every other game I played, it was the first that really forced me to think. But now I want to switch gears to the other part of Mass Effect 1 that was exceptionally well done. It's something that's kind of difficult to name or label, but I feel the best word for it would be atmosphere. From the visuals, story, and the lore, all the way down to the levels of music, Mass Effect 1 felt like you were stepping into another world. And this is perhaps the most important aspect of the original Mass Effect's design. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like they lost this in the sequels, and sadly I don't think it will ever return. One of the most important factors that contributes to this was the level design. Mass Effect 1 was unique in the way that I feel the levels were designed less from a gameplay perspective and more from a world building perspective. Uncharted worlds aside, each level took much longer to complete and were filled with a lot more space. The worlds were larger, with more room to explore, and while the looting system wasn't necessarily the greatest, it encouraged players to invest and delve into every nook and cranny. On top of that, the levels were quite literally set up as worlds, with more to do than just your current objective. There were vendors to buy from, side missions to complete, and people to talk to. Combat, exploration, and conversation were all interwoven into each environment. You can kill some Geth, pick up some new loot, and then find dock workers hiding in a nearby shack. Or you can be ambushed by an undercover Asari commando. Or you can talk to that hilarious crazy Salarian on Virmire.
Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!
But all these moments occur organically. They don't feel forced or segmented like they do in the sequels. In this way, each level felt like less of a game and more like a cohesive world. The Citadel was much larger and expansive, offering you the freedom to travel wherever you want. While we all probably use the rapid transit system, it's actually possible to explore the entire Citadel without any loading screen, which is a much different approach than Mass Effect 2 and 3, where the game was much more segmented. The levels in Mass Effect 2 and 3 were so much smaller and tighter, giving no time for the player to invest, or the environment to really sink in. They felt more claustrophobic and linear. The levels were shorter and consisted mostly of corridor shooting. Sure, there were a lot more levels to play, but there were a few that truly stood out. Even the Uncharted worlds in Mass Effect 1, which admittedly weren't the greatest, had more gameplay variety, like the crazy biotic woman, or the drone station on the moon, or that terrifying husk maze. Most of the levels in Mass Effect 2 and 3 just weren't that memorable or exciting. They still have memorable moments, sure, but those moments were usually narrative moments contained in the cutscenes, and they weren't integrated into the world itself. And to go even further, the aesthetic themes and songs were unique to each world. They're all distinctly different from each other. They all look, sound, and feel different. From the watery tropics of Virmire to the cold, frozen hallways of Noveria, the visual themes were very clearly defined, and they all stood out from one another. The music for each world is unique, and really does a great job of capturing the tone of each location, with the mysterious vibes on Pharos, the more constructed corporate tones on Noveria, and the completely alien electronica on Ilos. And although I'm not really a huge fan of electronic music, I must say that the original Mass Effect soundtrack has really grown on me, simply because whenever I hear it, I'm re-immersed back into the world. I would even go as far to say that Mass Effect 1 has the best soundtrack design of any game I've ever played. Not to say that it has the best soundtrack, since that is very subjective, but from a design perspective, the music was created to make the game stand apart and feel like something fresh. While the sequels definitely had some great orchestral tracks, they didn't ground me in the world in the same way that Mass Effect 1 soundtrack did. And Mass Effect 2 and 3 just feel so shallow and empty in comparison. It's something that's difficult to describe, but I feel it's best shown on Ilos, which is easily my all-time favorite Mass Effect mission. And maybe it's just me, but I feel much more immersed and invested into each world than I ever did in Mass Effect 2 and 3. While the sequels felt like really great games to play, Mass Effect 1 felt like a really great world to explore. And in that world, you feel much more important and empowered. In Mass Effect 1, you feel like a Spectre. You feel like a free agent without any limits. Becoming a Spectre in the original game was a big deal. You had to prove to the Council that you were worthy of the honor, and over the course of the game, this was constantly mentioned and referred to. In Mass Effect 2 and 3, the Council begrudgingly upholded your Spectre status in a way which can only be described as a weak tribute to the original game. And in the sequels, your Spectre status has no weight or meaning behind it. If you weren't a Spectre in Mass Effect 2 or 3, what about the story would really change? But in the original game, the story would fall apart if it wasn't for your Spectre status. And as much as it may seem like a small detail, being inducted into the Spectres was a narrative decision that really cemented the core concepts of the original game. It gave a narrative explanation as to how you, as the player, could make the decisions that you do, and it really helps to place you into the shoes of Commander Shepard. Now, I'm not trying to say that the original Mass Effect is perfect, because it's still a very flawed game. The combat lacks polish, especially when the frame rate dips really low at times. There were some moments that felt a bit cheesy, the uncharted worlds were just a mix of about 5 different structures, the Mako handled like a brick with jetpacks, and navigating the environment was way too difficult at times. The original Mass Effect was bold. It wasn't afraid to carve its own identity, and while this makes its strengths shine brightly, it also highlights its weaknesses. But for those of us who really took the time to invest ourselves into Mass Effect 1, those problems quickly fade away into the background of a truly incredible game. Which brings me to my all-time favorite moment of Mass Effect. When you're driving through the Prothean facility on Ilos with the sun shining in from above, the dead stasis pods lining either side, and the Vigil theme playing in the background. It's a moment that oozes with atmosphere, and you can just feel the history in the walls. It's a moment that really encapsulates what I've been talking about, and the moment that really made me fall in love with Mass Effect.
What are all those things on the wall? Some kind of containers?
They look like stasis pods. The Protheans probably tried to keep themselves alive through cryogenic freezing. Something must have gone wrong. This bunker became their tomb. The pods are dead as well as anyone inside.
There are very few games that do such an effective job at world building, and the original Mass Effect is one of them. There's just a certain charm to it, and I'm not sure this video can really do it justice. For all of its flaws, the original Mass Effect is one of only a handful of games that I've played which left me with a feeling of awe, where when the credits rolled, I just said, wow, that was incredible. What Mass Effect 2 and 3 gained in its shooting mechanics, it lost in its soul. But as time goes on, it seems as though the original Mass Effect has faded from the memory of its fans. And sadly, I feel that Mass Effect 1 shares the same fate as the Protheans, that soon is going to be a long forgotten relic, and that this video is going to be its vigil.